Good morning, everyone, or good day, depending on where you are in the world. Welcome to today's Meeting of the Minds webinar, the release of RPA's fourth regional plan, integrating health and equity into regional decision-making. My name is Christina Olson, and I'm Program Director of Meeting of the Minds. Meeting of the Minds is a global thought leadership network and platform with year-round digital and in-person programming. We connect global urban sustainability, innovation, and technology leaders across sectors to share best practices, tools, and solutions through our blog, monthly webinar series, pop-up events, workshops, meetups, and conferences. Our most recent annual Fall Leadership Summit convened in October in Cleveland, Ohio, and the archive, including recording, slides, and photos, are all available on our website. Our next summit will take place in Sacramento, California, November 27 to 29, 2018. All right, I'm pleased to introduce our two presenters today. Mandu Sen is Program Manager of Regional Plan Association, working primarily on the fourth regional plan. She focuses on how long-term planning can improve health and equity and works to translate the impact of digital technologies into policies around infrastructure and governance. Christopher Jones is Senior Vice President and Chief Planner of Regional Plan Association, where he directs research and planning. Since joining RPA in 1994, he has led many multidisciplinary initiatives to improve economic, social, and environmental conditions in the New York, New Jersey, Connecticut region. Chris leads research for RPA's fourth regional plan, a long-range blueprint for the metropolitan region that came out last month and is the subject of today's webinar.
Well, thank you very much, Christina, and good morning, good afternoon, good evening to everyone on the call. And, you know, we've certainly long been admirers of Meeting of the Minds and really appreciate that you've given us this forum to share what we've been working on for the last 5 years. As the title says, this is the fourth region-wide plan that RPA has prepared in its nearly 100-year history. We produce a new plan about once every generation when we determine that the fundamental dynamics and challenges facing the region have changed enough to require a new direction and strategy. And as I said, we started this one in earnest about 5 years ago and released it last November. And it's nearly a 400-page web-based document with 61 recommendations. So we're only going to be able to scratch the surface here today. And what Mandu and I are going to try to do in the next 30 minutes is provide an overview of the plan's themes and contents, talk about how we were able to bring issues of health and equity to the center of what is really a physical development plan, and highlight a few of the recommendations that demonstrate that connection. So we certainly encourage people to go to the plan website, fourthplan.org, to dig deeper if we pique your interest here today. So next slide, Mandu. So RPA is a nonprofit research and advocacy organization. We have no governmental authority. Our influence is through the currency of our ideas and our ability to build support for them. We serve a region of 23 million people, stretching from central New Jersey up through New Haven and Connecticut. About a third of the population lives in the 5 boroughs of New York City, and the rest live in 782 other cities, towns, and villages, each one of them with their own land use and taxation authority. There's no governmental entity, no council of governments, no MPO responsible for this geography. And each of the 3 previous plans that we've done were produced, they were really products of their time, and they addressed the central planning and development issues of their era. The first plan, produced in 1929, was the first, metropolitan-wide plan of its type, and it really laid out a blueprint for much of the infrastructure and development and open space proposals that allowed the region to grow through World War II. Many of the systems that you have in place, from the George Washington Bridge to Jones Beach on Long Island, were part of that first plan. The second plan was produced in the 1960s, and in many ways it was a reaction to that, to what the first plan and all of the, investments of that era had wrought, and it really tried to produce a plan that addressed the issue of, auto-driven sprawl in the region and, white flight and deterioration in the region's cities. And the last plan that we reduced in the early 90s At that time, New York was really being questioned as to whether it's going to be able to maintain its place in the global economy. It had just gone through its worst recession since the Great Depression. Crime was at its peak. There was a lot about migration, and that plan really tried to, jumpstart investment in the region, and it was largely successful in promoting plans like the Second Avenue subway or a new mixed-use office district on the far west side. So next slide, please. So when we started to think about, whether it was time to do a fourth plan, I mean, clearly the region was doing much better than it had in the early 90s. But we were facing a very different set of issues than the ones that we faced then. New York had regained its stature in the global economy, and by many measures, we were doing quite well. But it was also in many ways a narrowly based prosperity, and one that relied on past investments that were reaching the end of their useful life. So we've called our first diagnostic report Fragile Success, partly to acknowledge that the region's achievements were real and substantial, but also to highlight that this success was incomplete and also at a risk of eroding. The report highlighted how much the region had changed over the last generation and what its current challenges looked like. And one of the most striking findings was just how much the relative fortunes of New York City and the suburbs and smaller cities outside it had reversed from everything we had been used to in the post-war era. So if you looked at economic growth from the mid-70s, when New York City was coming out of its fiscal crisis, to about a decade ago, 90% of the jobs almost were created outside of the 5 boroughs of New York City. In the last decade, that's been totally reversed, with well over 600,000 jobs in New York City alone, and stagnant growth outside of the city. So that creates a very different set of challenges. Instead of looking at how to revitalize the central city, the challenge now is how to manage and sustain urban growth while expanding jobs and housing outside of the city. Next slide. We also documented, how much the already wide economic and racial disparities worsened over this period. Income growth was stagnant, which greatly added to the affordability crisis that people were seeing. And, certainly rising inequality is a national and international dynamic, but it was more pronounced here, and it was layered on top of a region that is already one of the most economically and racially segregated in the country. Next slide. So climate change was just a footnote in the last regional plan that we did in the early 90s, but since then it has slowly been making itself felt. And Hurricane Sandy and Irene demonstrated just how vulnerable we are. And so we produced some analyses showing that by 2050, the number of people living in areas at risk of flooding is estimated to double from about 1 million people today to about 2 million people in 2050. And the risk of permanent flooding from sea level rise, which was largely underappreciated, was something that we mapped and calculated what would be underwater in 1, 3, and 6 feet of sea level rise, which is likely to take place over the next century. Although we don't really know how quickly, but we know exactly, pretty much, where it will occur when it does. Next slide. So if climate change is our biggest long-term challenge, transportation is our most immediate crisis. And if there is one thing we didn't anticipate when we started doing the plan, it's that the transit system would begin to fail before we finished it. But starting with damage to the one set of passenger rail tunnels that we have crossing the Hudson, to the daily delays and cancellations that we now have on subways, buses, and commuter rails, it's become the biggest economic, quality of life, and political issue currently. But this was obviously a crisis that was a long time in the making. A combination of underinvestment and rapid growth in ridership was straining the transportation system. Much of the system was built a century ago and wasn't built for either the volumes or needs of today's riders. And one of the central conclusions that we came to is that we couldn't just produce a physical plan. We had to look at the institutional and financial structures that would have to be implemented in order for the plan to become a reality. And by and large, we found that the institutions, many of which have been established, a half century or more or longer ago, were really ill-equipped for the types of challenges that we have today. And Exhibit A is just how long and how much more expensive it is to build new infrastructure in New York than it is in most other places. This chart just shows how much more rail transit other regions are building and how much less it costs to do it in those other cities. Next slide. And we then modeled what we thought the region could achieve if we were able to address these challenges. And so we evaluated several different future scenarios and contrasted what is likely to happen if we continue with current policies and levels of investment, and what's possible if we can implement the right set of strategies. And we documented all of this in a vision report that we called Charting a New Course. And one of the key insights is captured in this chart that I have here, which is showing that in the last 25 years, the region added close to 2 million jobs and 3 million people. But with the level of housing production and infrastructure investment that we are making now, we'd only be able to capture about half of that economic growth in the future. And it's not because people and businesses don't want to come here, it's just that there isn't the capacity to accommodate them. So we think with the right set of policies in place, we could produce a much more robust level of economic growth, which is necessary both to expand opportunity and to invest in climate resilience and all the things that we need to do. So with that, we obviously, growth is only part of the equation. We don't want growth of the next 25 years to look like what we've had in the previous one. We need it to result in a broader based prosperity that also addresses inequality and sustains a healthy environment. And with that, I'm going to turn it over to Mandu, who is going to talk how we started to make those connections.
Thank you, Chris. And really, it's rarely been more urgent to make these connections explicit, to make sure that as we grow, this growth really truly benefits everyone. You see it really clearly when you look at homelessness. Homelessness has tripled in the last 20 years, just as rent has kept on increasing. And just possibly haven't even seen the bottom yet. We're concerned that if housing prices continue to rise, many, many more people in the households are at risk of displacement and homelessness. Even if not displaced, they may have to manage on even smaller incomes or be forced to live with poor housing conditions like overcrowding. Our report Pushed Out outlines the risk and maps out communities that live in areas that are, at high risk of displacement. And it is too often the communities of color that are particularly vulnerable. In the New York region, nearly 1 in 5 Black and Hispanic kids live in low-performing public school districts. This, as opposed to less than 1 in 10 white or Asian children. This is, of course, not an accident, but an outcome of discriminatory housing and education policies from decades ago that we are all living with. And it's important to remember that these issues are not abstract. They end up costing people their health. More than 80% of what influences a community's health is not healthcare, but factors like poverty and walkability, air quality. And building on the example of education, people with a college degree typically live 5 years longer than those without it. So educational disparities early on can literally cost someone years off of their lives. This helps explain why, despite significant life expectancy gains in recent years in the New York region, there are big gaps between different communities. People in Bergen County in New Jersey live 5 years longer than people in nearby Essex. People in the Upper East Side of Manhattan live 10 years longer than their neighbors right up north in East Harlem. Whites live 5 years longer than blacks. So if the plan is to succeed, we really need to make the region work for everyone and make a commitment to invest in particular in communities that have traditionally been left behind. That is why the values that guided the creation of this plan are not just prosperity and sustainability, traditional planning goals, but also equity and health. because everyone deserves to live a healthy life, regardless of their race, income, or where they live. Moving to the plan itself. There are 4 chapters in the plan. As Chris mentioned, we're going to give you an overview of each and then cover a few select recommendations and details. And you can find out more on our website, fourthplan.org. The overarching chapters include preparing for climate change, building a 21st century transportation network, and making the region affordable for everyone. And in order to enable all this, we're also placing a particular emphasis on governance reform. So the 4th chapter of the plan is dedicated exclusively to that. Let's get started with climate change. As Chris described, the impacts of climate change are already here with us, and they will only increase. In fact, the health of every American will be impacted by climate change, whether it's flooding, disruptions, heat, or something else. And of course, it is the most vulnerable, low-income communities, communities of color, people with disabilities, people with existing health conditions, seniors, who will be hurt the most by these impacts. That is why the plan's proposals are focused both on reducing our carbon emissions and other sources of pollution, and on preparing for climate change and across its multiple manifestations. These proposals include adapting to our changing coastline, protecting dense centers and retreating from other areas, bringing nature into our communities and improving our natural assets so that we can cool our environment, provide ecosystem services, and reconnect all our communities with nature. And also creating a far greener energy system than we have today. Zooming in specifically on climate adaptation, we do not have the governance structures in place to rethink our coastline. The New York region is fragmented between different states and municipalities, and different subject areas are divided by agency. This infographic shows the alphabet soup of agencies governing Seabright in New Jersey. But as the saying goes, united we stand, divided we fall. We can't effectively address the challenge of climate change one municipality at a time. And we can't do it on budgets that only come about from the federal government after catastrophic storms. We need a new governing body to protect us from flooding. We're proposing a regional coastal commission to set standards and work with communities to negotiate local solutions to regional problems. The commission should be supported by new adaptation trust funds in each of the 3 states. Just a small surcharge on property casualty insurance could raise over $2 billion a year, money that would be spent on designing, prioritizing, and implementing more resilience projects. Funding criteria will include not only infrastructure, but projects such as community resilience and health. This will give each community time to prepare and plan long-term for rising seas, creating a process that minimizes upheaval from dislocation and creates new community assets from areas flooded. Another project the Commission could take on is that of a new national park in the New Jersey Meadowlands. Despite decades of human development, the Meadowlands remains the largest network of wetlands in the New York region, and it's likely to be one of the first places inundated by sea level rise. We're proposing a new model of national park, a park that demonstrates in real time how our climate is changing. The park's boundaries would expand over time as sea levels rise. Instead of seeing their communities flooded regularly, residents of towns in and about the Meadowlands would have the opportunities to sell their home to the National Park Service and know that their property was going to help restore valuable wetlands and protect the region. Chris?
Thanks, Mandu. So turning back to transportation, as I said earlier, the problems with the transportation system have been building for some time, and our solutions try to focus on, what we think are 3 core issues. First, modernization, particularly catching up with how technology is transforming mobility and customer expectations. The public sector has been slower to adopt to these than private sectors and individuals have been. So that's a key focus of reorienting the transit system. Second, expanding capacity to handle the growth in travel, both what we've already seen as well as what we can expect in the future. And finally, reorienting the transit network to serve people and markets that it doesn't reach today. It's a very different region than the system was built for, and we need to orient it towards where the growth is in the future as well as where the need is. Next slide, please. So these are the four functional areas that the recommendations are organized underneath. And I just want to talk a bit about one of them, rebuilding the subways, to show how we designed recommendations with health and equity in mind. And I know that the subways are uniquely about New York, but I also think it demonstrates how to approach a key economic imperative with health and equity in mind. Next slide. So the daily disruptions on the subway were a long time in the making, and they're not going to be fixed overnight. But at current rates of investment, it will take 50 years just to modernize the signal system that's been in place since the 1930s, and which is probably the most important action for giving the system the reliability and capacity that it needs. So what we proposed is a 15-year comprehensive modernization program. A major part of it is improving the customer experience, which starts with the subway stations where people enter the system. Many of these are too small to handle the number of riders they have, and they're poorly designed. And our proposals would not only make the system run better because the people could get on and off the trains quicker and the trains could get in and out of the station faster, but would also make the subway safer, quieter, cleaner, and less stressful, including making them more accessible to a wider range of people. But in order to accomplish this, we proposed a number of governance reforms, including a subway reconstruction authority. But we also need to rethink how we utilize a system that runs 24 hours a day and makes it hard to repair and maintain. So we've looked at how to create wider windows that will get the work done faster with the least amount of pain. And they all involve two principles. One is making sure that we provide alternative transit, from running frequent high-speed bus service to making greater use of on-demand service as a transit option, so that there's always a transit option for those who need it. And it also means that you have to restore the system to much better service than it was left with. Otherwise, it just isn't worth the pain. And one proposal is to rebuild entire lines, taking them out of service for up to 12 to 18 months, but returning them with much improved service, from rebuilt subway stations to rebuilt track lines, so that you have a modern system that will be good for decades to come. And another, probably one of the most controversial that we put out, is to replace late night subway service with frequent high-speed bus service for weekday nights, Monday through Thursday, from 12:30 a.m. to 5. That's something that if you look at what the alternative is for when service would be disrupted at other times of the week, and how, what the comparison of services between frequent bus service and late night subway service, we think that's a proposal that, provides the quickest way to maintain, with providing the least amount of disruption. And I just want to address one, other transportation issue. Matt, if you go to the next slide. Where we're talking about expanding subways in the future. So beyond modernization, over the long term, we want to see the subway system extended to the parts of the city that don't have service today. And the 8 lines on this map would extend the system to areas that have the density to support transit service, and that have large numbers of low-income households that are most dependent on transit. Next slide. And just one other issue that I wanted to mention, that's one that probably wouldn't be there without a focus on health and equity. We've recommended a number of urban highways that could be decked over or redesigned, largely to reconnect neighborhoods that were divided during the era of highway construction, but also to improve safety and air quality in some of the most environmentally burdened neighborhoods in the region. Next slide. So kind of breezing through these large topics. The next, I just wanted to cover the area on affordability and making the region affordable for everyone. Perhaps one of the most ambitious goals in the plan. New York has always been expensive, but it's hard to imagine how we can reach any of the plan's goals without giving more people the opportunity to live in neighborhoods that have stable, affordable housing, good schools, access to jobs, and a healthy environment. And to do that, if you go to the next slide, we have proposals to address, these core issues. Fundamentally, we need to build housing to keep up with demand. We estimate that we need about 1 million more homes on top of what we have today and what we are projected to build in the future. But if we're going to give everyone choices and to prevent displacement in changing neighborhoods, we need to preserve and create affordable housing in all parts of the region, not just where it is today. We also have to address the income side of the equation by encouraging job growth for a broad range of skills and incomes. And we have to put attention on the types of places that we're making to ensure that we're not just building more housing, but also creating complete communities. So if you go to the next slide, I just want to give one example for how we think we can both meet the region's housing supply needs and create communities that expand opportunities and support healthier communities. There's an enormous potential around the region's commuter rail stations to create mixed-use, mixed-income communities. We estimate that as many as 250,000 new homes just on surface parking lots that could be freed up with more shared parking and eventually with autonomous vehicles. But what's missing in many places is the zoning to allow it and the services to support it. And while we're seeing an increasing number of places start to build around these train stations, progress is slow and often oriented towards high-income market housing. And if you go to the next slide, so what we think we need is a different regulatory environment, one that gives municipalities both the tools they need and the incentives to apply them. And we'll be working in all 3 states to build on, current housing regulations so that they all incorporate 3 features. One is allowing multifamily housing as of right in appropriate locations and at the appropriate levels of density. So that it's not just happening in some communities, but every place where it makes sense for that type of housing to be built. Secondly, applying inclusionary zoning statewide to ensure that all multifamily housing has an affordability component. And finally, to set targets for municipalities, as states such as New Jersey and California have already done. This will be a long-term effort, but I think there is opportunities to start now. So I'm going to turn this back over to Mandu to cover the governance recommendations and take us to the end.
Thank you, Chris. So, as we said earlier, none of the actions we're recommending would be possible without major institutional reform. Our current institutions are just not taking the bold actions necessary to really make a dent in things. The projects that are underway are all too often either too expensive, take too long, or both. And low-income communities and communities of color are very, very often left behind in decision-making. Which is why we're recommending to reform transit governance to improve operational efficiency and reduce costs of capital construction, to create new institutions in order to tackle climate change, like the Regional Coastal Commission I discussed earlier, to remedy inequities in land use by, among other things, making property taxes more rational and school funding more equitable, and by incorporating technology into government. And just to show that we practice what we preach, Chris mentioned earlier in the process that developing the plan was a partnership. And as part of this plan, we undertook a new partnership, new to us, a collaboration with community groups across the region that represent low-income communities and communities of color. So as we developed existing conditions, our partners knocked on doors and conducted surveys and focus groups. As we created our recommendations, our partners provided input on priorities and specific policies. And even as we speak, we're working together to implement plan policies such as inclusionary housing, going together to give testimony, etc. One outcome of this process that's worth highlighting was a pledge by 160 organizations across the region and counting to ensure that the plan is implemented in an equitable way and be partners in the process of implementation going forward. Another key outcome of our partnership was infusing inclusivity into our governance recommendations, including by reforming local planning decision-making. Local land use decisions are too often slow, unpredictable, and exclude key voices. We need a process that is more inclusive and more effective. While this might sound like a contradiction, we think that by opening up the planning process earlier, we'll get a broader audience that will look for successful ways to actively improve their neighborhoods, not only block development. Key elements of our reform include fixed timelines for engagement and decision-making, evaluation of health impacts, diversifying planning and zoning boards, and beyond all that, state technical support, both for the planning tools and in terms of community engagement. Another area where you really see the crisis of governance in the region and really in the nation is technology. Government lags so far behind the private sector here, in some cases it literally uses best practices from the previous century. Many policy efforts have focused on expanding digital skills or technology procurement reform, all critical tasks. We've also been paying attention to the adoption of specific tools and technologies. For example, technology is going to be critical to reform the planning process the way we want to. But we think that planners' engagement with technology needs to go much further. One place you can really see the digital divide is internet access. In the New York region, over 40% of poor and low-income households lack access to the internet, which is high speed enough to do things like complete your homework or submit a job application. But it's also important to look at the digital divide between the United States and its international competitors. So here you can see that, for example, the same monthly cost buys far faster internet speeds in Paris and in Tokyo compared to anywhere in the United States, really, but also in the New York region. And while technology can seem daunting, government actually has many levers to pull. Just as we did with energy and other infrastructure, we need to start treating the internet as a public utility, and also we need to start planning for it as a physical asset. This is why we're recommending various measures, such as government streamlining access to critical infrastructure, whether it's conduits underground or utility poles or rooftops. In some cases, government also needs to invest directly in public infrastructure, such as conduit. A particular focus needs to be on providing affordable or free access to low-income communities by actions such as enabling mesh networks. Using buses as nodes is one idea we're promoting. We also need to start treating data as a strategic policy priority. A regional planning census can take on tasks such as developing inputs when deciding on geofencing autonomous vehicles, or creating survey tools that can be used by community groups. Both internet infrastructure and data policy also present new business opportunities that the public can gain from, as well as new risks that need to be managed. That said, what we gave you is really just a snapshot of the 4th regional plan. You can delve into its details on our website. But I wanted to end on some of the renderings that we did to imagine how our streets and public spaces could look like if the plan were implemented. I also want to take the opportunity to thank the thousands of people who partnered with us in its creation. In particular, I wanted to call out the incredible support and advice we received from our funders, including Ford Foundations, the JPB Foundation, Robert Wood Johnson Foundation, and the Rockefeller Foundation. And with that, I'll return the microphone to Christina.
Wonderful. Thanks, Mandu. And thank you, Chris. We're now ready for the audience question and answers. To all of our listeners, please type any questions you have for Mandu or Chris into the questions panel in your attendee control panel, which you'll probably find on the right side of your screen. We'll try to get through as many as we can before the top of the hour. And let's see what's come in. First off, I'll pose this one to Mandu. This is from David. He's asking if he's allowed to share this information with others and on social media.
Absolutely.
Okay, great.
Welcome that, in fact.
Perfect. And also in your attendee control panel, there's a handout section, and if you find that, you can click. There's a PDF in there, and that's this presentation as well. So that's there, and also all of the information from their plan is on their website. Here's a question for Chris from another Chris. The figures on job growth in New York City versus outlying areas speaks to the general financialization of the national and global economy. If the new plan is primarily a physical plan, does it address this issue simply by trying to facilitate access to New York City jobs by residents in outlying areas? Is this the best way to address equity?
Great question, and the quick answer is that it's more than trying to facilitate access to jobs in Manhattan and the core of the region, and it tries to create both the physical and institutional conditions to allow for job growth that is distributed throughout the region, and that also provides for a range of industrial, high-income office jobs, service jobs, and middle-skill office sector jobs as well. And one of the biggest opportunities that we think there is in the region is in some of the smaller, often known as legacy cities, that are some of them just outside of the region's boundaries, like Newark, New Jersey, or Yonkers in New York, and some of them on the on the edges of the region. That's Trenton, New Jersey, Bridgeport, Newburgh, New York. These are places that both have the the infrastructure and physical capacity. They have the the population. They have the and it's more beneficial to create job opportunities in these areas that are easier for many people to get to than something in a suburban office park or in downtown Manhattan. So there is a section in the plan that looks into how to create well-paying jobs throughout the region. That said, it is not accompanied by a specific workforce or or economic strategy beyond that. That those are obviously critical, and something where I think we need to connect the people who are doing the physical planning with those who are doing the workforce and economic development planning.
Great.
And if I may just jump on that. It's true that New York saw a lot of growth in financial jobs, but it actually also saw striking growth in tech jobs, and that was as a result of many very explicit physical investments made by New York City in the last decade. And those are also things that places across the region and really the country should be thinking about.
Wonderful. Thanks for both of you for chiming in on that. I have a question for you, Mandu, from Ellie. With regards to housing affordability, does rent control help or hurt the availability of affordable quality housing?
I will actually deflect that question to Chris.
Perfect.
Sure. Yeah, so rent control is a really kind of complicated question, but I think what's happened in the this is one of the changes that we've seen happen over the last several years. I mean, rent control it doesn't necessarily restrict the amount of housing which is created. It obviously preferences people who already have housing from people who are looking for it, but with the most intense problem that we have with it, where effective rent control is actually helps to stabilize neighborhoods and limit displacement in a place in city and a region which is rapidly changing. So I think they have to be, designed correctly, but we think it's an important part of a strategy that creates, stable, affordable neighborhoods. And, we have a particular focus on areas outside of New York City, for which the regulations are, generally much more of a patchwork than you have within the city itself.
Great, thanks. And speaking of stable communities, Bill asks, this is for you again, Chris. Bill asks, what about sea level rise? By mid-century, all of this is no longer defensible from sea level rise. People will be migrating inland, where we will need to build new urbanity with ideal private auto-free transport systems. Who's planning for that?
So it's a good and complex question. We have looked at it. We think it's obviously a very serious problem, but a manageable one if we start planning for it now. So if you look at it, and just to clarify, we don't know how quickly this is going to take place, but we do know what's going to be covered with 1 foot of sea level rise. We know what will be covered with with 6 feet of sea level rise. In some cases, these are low density places where you really do have to start planning for just kind of moving back from the coastline. In other places, you actually have a mixture of high ground and wetlands, and so you can actually start to shift some of the housing and development to some of the high ground areas, so you can try to keep a community intact, even as you're letting it evolve over a period of 20 to 30 years. So I think the important thing is, as Mandu was discussing when she started talking about the Regional Coastal Commission, is to start planning now, to give communities the tools that they need to do that, and to create a coordinated strategy, because obviously a solution that might be put in place by one town or village can have impacts on its neighbors as well.
Wonderful, thanks. Okay, I've got a couple of questions that are linked to the proposed commission. One from Linda says, thanks for the presentation, very cool ideas. Can you talk about the commission you proposed? What's the likelihood of this happening and the implementation path forward? And also a question from Jesse, can you expand on the Regional Coastal Commission and how the adaptation trust funds would work in detail? They are based on property taxes, but can you give even more detail?
So actually, they're based on surcharges on insurance rather than property taxes. Actually, I'll let Chris take on the rest of it.
Sure. So starting with the last part of it and how the adaptation funds would work, what we're proposing are state level adaptation funds that would be capitalized with a surcharge on homeowners' property insurance. The level that we had kind of pegged as a starting point is based on the needs that were identified for coastal resilience following Hurricane Sandy. And in New York State, that would amount to about a $5 a month surcharge. In New Jersey, it would be $15 because the unfunded needs there are higher. But it would be something that could fund revolving loan funds and other mechanisms with them as well. Now besides just getting the political will to enact them, the tricky part gets to, I think, the first part of kind of the regional commission that we're talking about. Because there is so much between the different states, including the New York Harbor, where the source of a lot of the sea level rise and flooding takes place, is central to 2 different states. We do think there needs to be coordination across state lines, but the rules for the adaptation fund is that each state would have a certain amount that they could devote to priority in-state projects, and then there would be an amount in reserve that the commission would have a number of criteria for which they would select high priority regional projects.
Great, thanks, Chris. Victor asks, how does the plan address historic preservation?
You know, it's part of the, building complete communities part. So if you look at, what it is that makes, many of these, older cities and towns successful, it's the ones that have been able to maintain their historic downtown. So, so we have proposals in there, for example, to enact, historic, tax credits where, where they don't exist, for example, in New Jersey. And I think, within the, places that, that have historic preservation, protections already. I think we just would like to, it's one of the places where, we certainly, would propose most historic districts, remaining, but really looking at, the regulations that are in place to enact them just to make sure that they continue to make sense.
Great, thanks. Melina asks, are urban agriculture and urban gardening also part of the plan? I know, Mandu mentioned ecosystem services and a bunch of housing stuff, but how does urban agriculture and urban gardening fit in?
So yes, absolutely. And there are really two ways of thinking about it. The first is sort of really supplying our food system and improving the offering of food in the region, and particularly in urban low-income communities. And secondly, it's about cooling our communities and bringing nature into urban communities where sort of nature lacks. So we sort of see urban gardening as sort of part of both of those strategies. So on the one hand, we're really kind of proposing, and this is something I think we're all going to have to learn and develop a science around, but we really need to start reforming our design guidelines to do things like figure out what kind of interventions and where would keep temperatures as cool as possible as our cities continue warming, and heat is a really big problem. At the same time, I mentioned planning reform. One of the things we want to include in planning, and particularly in areas that have high food needs because they're very low income, etc., is doing a food needs assessment, and then sort of coming up not just one solution, but a range of solutions. So really creating the tools for local food planning, and urban agriculture can be part of that. Additionally, as we're thinking about our housing policy and making sure that development first and foremost benefits existing communities, we're sort of thinking about policies such as community land trusts that include, of course, housing, and that's one of the primary impetuses, but also the actions like preserving assets like community gardens.
Wonderful. Nikos has a question. This also relates to sort of hyper-local resources, I suppose. Have you considered some disruptive changes in the utilities provision model towards distributed systems? For instance, energy based on renewable by large number of small producers, or transportation based on self-driving cars, which might replace the current centralized systems?
Yeah, we have, and I'll confess we've only scratched the surface of that, and I think the place where we have looked into it, most closely is in the use of microgrids to supplement the electricity grid system. That there's both for resiliency purpose of having more redundant systems, and for kind of supplementing the the power needs of the grid itself, which is strained at in peak period uses that we're looking at facilitating greater use of microgrids as part of the energy system. But I think the larger question of providing incentives for renewables of all kinds while maintaining a really robust electricity grid is one of the issues that we really need to delve into deeper. I mean, I think one of the implications of this plan is I think a lot of regional plans are now where you're trying to get people to use to use transit, to use to get out of carbon emission based transportation and development. And one thing that's going to do is create more demand for electricity. So I think the question of linking rising electricity demand with greater use of renewables is one of the kind of more complex issues that we need to face.
And just hopping on that, internet is also a utility, and one of the purposes, really one of the key purposes of our internet recommendations is opening up the infrastructure so that communities can connect themselves. And if the infrastructure is open, there are there really are many models like mesh networks that can successfully provide internet services, for example. Another thing we're emphasizing is enabling partnerships locally that can be really, really powerful. For example, with anchor institutions like hospitals and educational institutions, you already see successful kind of programs around around mobility and transit, and that can be a leverage point for creating, say, community-based shared transportation models.
Great, thanks. We have a few questions around the partnership model and to go forward with the infrastructure changes on the transportation side of things. Ashok asks, seems like rebuilding of the subway system is a monumental task. Why are we not involving the private sector in public-private partnerships to redevelop the subway system and, in broader terms, our infrastructure? It's ironic that the subway system was initially built and operated by the private sector. And Leo asked to drive regional level initiatives for smart infrastructure. What is the best entity to do that? Is it private-public partnership? Is it dependent on the specific region or state or joint state effort? Is the approach regional dependent? And Jesse is also asking on expanding on the Subway Reconstruction Authority. How would it be designed? Elected body, nonprofit? How would it interact with the MTA and other transit authorities in the region? And how would it be financed? So that's a lot, but basically, what does that model look like?
Sure. Good. That leaves me room to skip around. No, I mean, I think just starting with the with the public-private partnership piece of this, there's certainly room within the system that we have to incorporate greater use of public-private partnerships with it. And these and there are a few specific recommendations in the plan to move that from from allowing design build types of contracting, which is just allowed in most places, but not parts of the New York infrastructure system, and certainly looking at at ways to harness the private sector's ability to use technology and data. That said, there's you have to be clear on the limits of what that model can produce. It's not going to produce new revenue sources in most cases. So it's a way of using the revenue and new revenue in a way that can be done more efficiently while maintaining a public sector control over the over the ultimate objectives that you're trying to achieve. So but I want to kind of address I was waiting for somebody to ask the how do you pay for it question with these. So it's and I think there's a few different components of it. One is that we have to be able to to build things cheaper than we do now, and that's part of the reason for kind of the really pushing the accelerated schedule for some of the improvements. Part of the reason it's so expensive is that projects get dragged out for so long. But there are other pieces too, and there's some recommendation in the plan, and we'll be coming out with some further detail later, just on the the number of places in the system from from when decisions are made at the state level for how to scope and fund projects, to to procurement systems within the agencies, to many of the work rules that are in place to put projects in place that that would really need to be reformed to have a feasible program for it. But in terms of dedicated revenue sources that would go towards it, there's there are a few that we think are kind of the most suitable for funding this sort of initiative. One is looking at at pricing vehicle use. It's kind of a new and we think better version of the congestion pricing proposals that were proposed a decade ago, but it's called the Move New York Plan as a place to start that would increase charges into Manhattan and lower them in places where there are fewer transit options, and fund both maintenance of the highways and bridges as well as new transit. We also think that there is tolling that should take place throughout the region. If you think of I-95 in Connecticut, which is both the whole corridor is underfunded and highly congested, and it's one of the few states in the region that has no tolling on it. So that would be a place that we would look at for it. The other two places, one is we've also proposed broadening the system of carbon pricing, which is in the region, that RGGI, the Regional Greenhouse Gas Initiative, which has 9 states in the Northeast, that essentially sets a market for emissions out of the power sector. If we broaden that to transportation, to fuels for commercial housing use, and have that geared to all emissions and not just carbon, we think that you could not only reduce greenhouse gases by about 20 to 30%, but raise anywhere from $2 to $3 billion a year that could be invested in the transit system and also in some of the other high priority items that we talked about.
Wow. Okay.
So I can't remember which ones I left out.
You covered a lot of ground there.
Yeah.
We're running short of time. We're almost at the end. I'm going to give the last question to Jessie, our executive director, who actually once worked at RPA, so she's got detailed insider knowledge. She's asking about basically the next 10 years of implementation of the plan and the strategies you intend to change policy and governance. So if you can cover that in maybe 20 seconds or 30 seconds, that would be great.
Right. So it's a huge 25-year plan, but we have kind of a set of issues that we want to that we think there's an opportunity to act on now. I think certainly the subway reconstruction is just an immediate priority for which there's political will. So that's one that and some of the funding mechanisms around that is certainly ones that we will put attention on immediately. But I think some of the harder, longer term issues we plan to start building coalitions around now. I mean, I don't think there's really political will there to do something like a regional coastal commission, but it's certainly something for which there is enough support that we can start building towards. So it's a combination of really acting on the immediate priorities and opportunities we have, as well as building a constituency for some of the longer term actions.
Wonderful. Thank you. That's a perfect way to wrap up. That's all the time we have for today. A short survey will pop up once you close your browser. We greatly appreciate your feedback, and we hope to see you at our next webinar coming up in February, also on our blog and at our annual Leadership Summit in November. More information on all of our events and resources is available at meetingoftheminds.org. That concludes our session for today. Thanks to the presenters, and for everyone, have a great day, and thanks again for attending.